Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Digital Classroom. Today we're going to talk about something that a lot of people struggle with. Color management and calibrations and when to use which color space. So join us for today's episode of Digital Classroom. Now let me start off by the most asked question. Why should I calibrate my monitor if my client doesn't use a calibrated monitor? The answer is actually pretty simple. Your client is used to that non-calibrated monitor. He sees every image on that monitor. So make sure that you calibrate, because otherwise your images on that client's monitor will look weird. Of course, we take into account that most photographers, especially professional photographers, do some sort of color calibration. So that's why it's important, even if your client doesn't have a calibrated monitor, that you have a calibrated workflow. But what is a calibrated workflow actually? Well, we have to make sure that red shows up as red, right? We have to make sure that the red in real life also translates to what you shoot in your images and what you see in print. And that's why we need a certain agreement upon where those colors are. And it's actually pretty simple. Those coordinates are divided into a color space. Now, a color space has three coordinates. It's a three-dimensional space. The first one is X, Y, and the big Y. So hue, saturation and luminance. That's for all color spaces the same. Now the coordinates of where those colors lay, that's a little bit different. Now the most known color space of course is sRGB. It's a relatively small color space. But we also know Adobe RGB, which is a bigger color space, as you can see up here. Now there's also a third color space that we use for monitors a lot, and that's P3. But let's do that when we talk about the monitors. So we now know that we have three coordinates which determine the color space, and we know that we have color spaces that determine those coordinates. So it makes sense, right, to make sure that everything that we shoot, that it fits into that color space and is calculated towards that color space. But how do we do it? Well, let me start off by explaining to you guys how we do it for the camera. Now, of course, as a photographer and doing video, the first thing we have to make sure is that our cameras are calibrated, right? But how do you calibrate your camera? Do you open it up with a screwdriver and change some stuff? Luckily, you don't have to. What we use in our studio and also on location is, of course, the Calibrite Color Checker. Now, in our case, we're using the Color Checker Duo because the Color Checker Duo also supports video and photography. It's a little bit more expensive, but it's still cheaper than buying two color checkers, one for photography and one for video. Now, when you look at the color checker, you see all these colored squares. And it's very important to understand why those squares are there and also why the gray ones are there. Now, when we look at calibration, we actually look at different parts. And let me simplify it. The first part is, of course, that three-dimensional color space. We have to make sure where red, green and blue, our primary colors, are located, but also cyan, magenta and yellow, our secondary colors. But all those colors are also in a balance, and that balance is actually through our white point. Now you might wonder, like, Frank, where's that white point? Did you ever heard about grayscale calibration or white balance? That's your white point. Now with photography we often choose the white point at D65, 6500 degrees Kelvin. But is that also right for the camera? Well, that's the first mistake a lot of people make. No. Because if we're shooting on a tungsten light, we have a different color temperature than, for example, fluorescent light or LED lighting. But we still have to take into account that we have a proper grayscale. Now, a proper grayscale for us, with calibrations, is a neutral grayscale. So we don't have any color infections, like for example a reddish tint or a blue tint. We all know those tints, right? They're very annoying. So we have to make sure that our grayscale is 100% neutral. Luckily in the digital system that's very simple. We have three coordinates in Photoshop, RGB. And to have a proper calibrated workflow, we have to make sure that that gray balance is actually neutral. So in other words, let's take 18% gray. We all know 18% gray, right? We love it. That's 128, 128, 128 in Photoshop. Now, if those three coordinates are exactly the same, we're talking about a neutral grayscale. Now, do remember that doesn't have to be the perfect grayscale, right? Because we are creative people, we like tinting. But to make a start, we have to make sure that that grayscale is 100% neutral. So the grayscale we now have neutral. Then we have those other coordinates for all those colors and defining the color space. We call that the color management system. And without going into depth, as you can see here, you place an analyzer in front of your monitor and that actually calibrates those settings. But hey, we're still talking about the camera, right? Yes. So how do we make sure that the camera does the same thing? Well, that's actually where that neutral color comes into place. The first thing you have to do is make sure that on location and in the studio your color balance is right. But hey Frank, if we shoot raw, can we do that afterwards? Yes, absolutely. And that's why we shoot the Color Checker Duo. Now when you shoot the Color Checker, make sure that you light it as flat as possible and of course with the same lighting as you do your model. Now, in other words, use a light meter. Because you remember those three coordinates, the X, the Y and the luminance, the big Y? Yes, that's where the light meter comes in. Because if you change one of those values, including the exposure, you will get other coordinates on those other settings. They all interact with each other like a little puppet. If everything is correct, you can move the puppet around, but if one of those strings isn't really nicely attached, the puppet will do strange things. And that's the same with your color space. Now, for the color, we use the Color Checker Duo. In Lightroom, you can create a so-called DCP profile. Now, the DCP profile is especially for cameras. Now, you may also have heard the term ICC profile. And the ICC profile is actually a slightly older profile, and we still use that, for example, for our monitors. Now, if you have a RAW converter that doesn't support DCP profiling, you can still create an ICC profile with the external software from Calibrate. Now you have to realize one thing, and that's very, very important. A DCP profile is more advanced for cameras. Meaning, if you create a DCP profile, we can use two different illuminations. For example, outside and inside. To make it really simple, we can still change the color balance afterwards. If you use an ICC profile, that's only for one illumination. In other words, that's fixed, so you can't change it. So for photography, using a DCP profile makes a lot more sense. So in Adobe Lightroom, we use the Color Checker Duo to create a proper setting for the camera. In other words, neutral gray and the proper coordinates for our camera. But at that point, we still haven't determined a color space. That's what we talk about later on in the video after the monitor. So now that we've done the camera and that you understand DCP and ICC, let's switch over to the monitor calibration. Now, when you look behind me, you can see our BenQ monitor and you can see my laptop. And both look exactly the same, right? You can't judge that now, but trust me, they look approximately the same. And you hear me saying approximately. And that's because, well, in all honesty, even when you do a proper calibration, you will never get all your displays and all your devices looking exactly the same. We have to make sure that we come as close as possible to perfect. So, for the camera, we use that color checker. But for the monitor, yeah, well, we actually use exactly the same technique. We use a color checker. Only the problem is, in this case, the color checker isn't in your hand. It's software that runs on your computer. Now, what does that software do? That software actually first asks you like, hey, what do you want to do? What kind of illumination do you want to do? What kind of gray point? What kind of light output? What kind of profiling? Now, we're going to skip everything for now. If you want more information about that, we can make another video about calibrating your monitor. But today, we want to make sure that everything fits together in the video. There are two options to calibrate your monitor. The first one is software-based. Now, of course, we all know the calibration of the monitor. You start up the software shows you those different squares and of course also grayscale. It does the calibration for you and at the end it creates an ICC profile and you load that in your operating system. That's the software-based method. One of the disadvantages of software is, well, it's software. So every time you open up the computer, it has to load that certain ICC profile for your monitor. Meaning, if you use the same monitor on a different laptop, you have to do the whole calibration again. If you use an iPad on that monitor, it will not look right. So what is another option? Another option is actually hardware calibration. Now with hardware calibration, you have one huge advantage. And that's that the calibration is done inside the monitor. And that's a big advantage. Think about this. I'm now using my MacBook, but what if I want to use any week's MacBook? I don't have to do another calibration because the monitor is hardware calibrated. Now, of course, there are differences between laptops, between GPUs, between, well, everything actually influences the color. But in all honesty, that's a little bit of nitpicking. If you have a proper setup system, you can probably switch over laptops without any problem and still get a way better performance on your monitor than without any calibration. And I mean way better. But the hardware calibration in the monitor doesn't stop there. Think about this, you can even use your iPad on that monitor. That's nice, right? But it doesn't stop there. Now when we open up Photoshop, for example, and we use an 8-bit file, and you start pulling those curves, you can see that you see artifacts in your image. In other words, you use too much bit depth, and the bit depth isn't available, so you get artifacts. And about the same thing can happen with calibration, depending on how much your monitor has to be corrected. When you do the calibration inside the monitor, there's a hardware lot lookup table. In essence, that means that you don't lose any colors, you don't get any artifacts. Let me just put it this way, it looks way better and it's way faster. So if you have the option, always go for a monitor with hardware calibration. So now we have two profiles. We have the DCP profile for our camera, and we have the ICC profile for our monitor. Remember, the monitor doesn't have to change any illumination. It's in your system and you don't change color balance on your monitor, right? So ICC profile works great for that. So now that we have our monitor and we have our camera calibrated, how the heck do we put everything together? What do we open up in Photoshop? So let's take a look at what we open up in Photoshop. Okay, so we have an ICC profile for the monitor, we have a DCP profile for the camera. How do we connect everything? Well, the first thing you have to realize is that those two, you don't need anymore. No, you don't need them. As explained before, we have proper color spaces who are already defined by, of course, the institution that defines the color spaces. For example, Adobe or whoever defines that color space. Now, if you look at your computer, you can see a lot of color spaces. You can see Adobe RGB, sRGB, Pro Photo RGB, web coded, uncoded, and the list goes on, and you just go like, what the heck should I select? So one of the most made mistakes, and I actually understand that mistake, is that when you go from Lightroom into Photoshop, you already have to determine your color space. And most people, well, they start out with, what should I do there? Should I do the calibration from the camera, because I'm actually editing that image, right? Or should I use the color space from the monitor because I'm looking at a monitor? Well, both are wrong. You have to realize that every calibration you do is designed for that object or that camera, that monitor. So you don't even use it anymore. The thing that you do is in Lightroom, when you edit your images, you're in RAW of course, you select the preset for that image. In other words, if you shoot something with the softbox and you have the color checker image, you sync that color image to all your images that you shot with that softbox. When you switched it over to a strip light, you shoot a new color checker and you create that profile again and you sync that to all your images with that strip light. And that's it, that's done. You don't touch that anymore. Now, as soon as you go from Lightroom into Photoshop, then you determine the real color space. And the real color space is Adobe RGB or sRGB. In most cases, we will use, of course, 16 bits Adobe RGB. Now, as soon as you're in Photoshop, that means that your file is now determined to that color space that you choose. In our case, we love to work in Adobe RGB because we get more vibrant colors, it's a bigger color space. And when we publish for the web, we can literally just convert our Adobe RGB to sRGB because it's a smaller color space. So, the camera profile is a DCP profile. The monitor profile is an ICC profile. The ICC profile is handled by the operating system or inside the monitor with a hardware calibrated monitor. The camera profile you only use in Lightroom or your RAW converter to make sure that your camera is showing the correct colors. As soon as you start editing in any software, being it Adobe Photoshop or Affinity or whatever you use, that's when you use the proper color spaces that are determined like Adobe RGB or sRGB. So, how do we fit everything together when we want to buy a monitor for photography? How do we choose which monitor we buy? So in the next chapter, we're going to talk about the monitors. Now, the monitor is actually one of the most important devices we use in our photography. It's the device that shows our images, it's the device where we actually do our retouching up. And in all honesty, I trust my BenQ monitor more than I trust any other monitor, even if I have a calibrated laptop. Now, why do I tell you guys this? Well, as you know, I love working on tablets. I use the XP Pen, for example, and when you're used to retouching on a tablet, especially a screen tablet, you never want to go back to anything else. But that screen, it's a really, really good screen. but it doesn't show me all the shadow detail. It doesn't show me the proper colors. The BenQ monitor is flawless. It shows me everything perfectly. So what I do when I retouch, I always look at the XP Pen display for retouching. And then as soon as I do something with color, that's when I have everything set up on the BenQ monitor. So all the software that uses tinting, like for example exposure software or Boris FX or DxO or Luminar, that's where we look at our BenQ monitor for the colors. And as soon as we're done and we start retouching again, that's when I look at the XP Pen, although they're all calibrated. So why is that BenQ monitor so much better? Very simple. All the displays are of course priced in a certain range. Now you can't expect a display that is used for a pen tablet to be a 100% Adobe RGB, because that pen tablet would be incredibly expensive. And in all honesty, you don't really need it, because you're retouching on it and you probably have a proper monitor to do color balance on. So why spend, let's say, 1,500 euros on a tablet, where you can get the same tablet for 500 euros with a limited color space? So when you buy a monitor, where should you look out for? Well, the first thing is, of course, make sure that you buy a monitor that's designed for photography or video. Those monitors don't really care about lag time, which is very important for gamers, and they don't really care about getting a lot of brightness out. Normally between 120 CDM and 130 CDM is more than enough for photography and video. If you have more, you probably are taking away contrast in your image, and when you print, it just looks very, very dull. And you see that a lot with people that use gaming monitors or that actually retouch on a laptop with the screen on full power. You will underexpose your images because it just looks so bright. So a proper photography monitor already is taking into account that part. So what can you buy? The first thing, of course, are the cheap monitors. Those monitors are often sRGB, and they are great if you only do stuff for the web, and if you are just a hobby photographer, those monitors are okay. But of course, the better monitors, that's the Adobe RGB monitors. Those monitors have a huge color space, and you can see all the colors in their beautiful brightness and saturation. But what if you don't have money for an Adobe RGB monitor? Is there anything in between? Well, you already heard me talking about the P3 color space. Now, when we look at Adobe RGB, again, look at this diagram, you can see that the Adobe RGB is pretty big. It still doesn't cover everything that we can see, but at least it's a huge color space. Now, when you look at the sRGB, you can see that it's a lot smaller. So that means that our colors are a little bit less vibrant. Now, there is a color space in between, and that's the P3 color space. Now, those monitors are very friendly priced, and they give you a way better performance than an sRGB monitor, but they don't show you everything that's an Adobe RGB monitor capable of. So if you use a P3 monitor, should you edit in a P3 color space? That's the question. No. If you've calibrated everything correctly, remember the puppet with all the strings, where you pull one string and it looks okay, and when you pull another one it will fall down if it's not in balance? That's the same thing when you switch between color spaces. If you use a Color Checker Duo for your camera, if you use a proper calibration tool for your monitor, and you choose the right color space in Photoshop, so Adobe RGB, Adobe will make the translation to the other color spaces without any problem. So you can edit in Adobe RGB on a P3 monitor. You have to make sure that you don't clip any color channel, so make sure that you use proper setups for that. But after that, you can switch without any problem to an Adobe RGB color space, to an sRGB color space. Or if you want to work in ProPhoto RGB, well, be my guest. As long as you have the proper calibration, those conversions will be done without any problem. Now, the main advantage of having a workflow that's fully calibrated seems to be the big question. Why? Is it only for your clients? Yes, but there's something else. In Lightroom and of course also in Photoshop, we love to use presets. Why invent the wheel twice, right? If we have a look that we really like, why should we make that look the same thing over and over again? So we store that as a preset. But if your colors constantly change, for example, because you don't use a color checker, that preset will give you different results every time you run that preset. And that isn't really reliable, right? We want to make sure that if we use the preset, it gives me the same result over and over. So that's why calibration is so important. Because now, because we have the proper setup, we have the proper grayscale, neutral, we have the proper coordinates for our red, green and blues, and we have the proper luminance. At that point, every time I run that preset. It doesn't matter if I shoot on the tungsten light or LED lighting or fluorescent lights, that preset will give you exactly the same results over and over. So it's not only for your client, it is actually to speed up your own workflow. Now, I hope in this video I gave you a little bit of explanation about how Colorspaces work and how calibration works. If you have any questions or you want me to go more in depth, leave comments below. This was actually a pretty simple representation of Colorspaces, but I think it's pretty complete. So, thank you so very much for watching, guys. And when you start buying a monitor, make sure you also take into account BenQ. I've been using their monitors for years and I really like them. See you again next time, guys. If you like what we do, subscribe to our channel, leave comments below, and of course smash that like button because we really like that. Stay creative, keep shooting, and see you next time. Bye, guys.